Good Lord, YouTube. What is up? How y'all doing? I'm Mike, and this is my channel, Solid State Alchemy, and we're in my basement. I'm in my basement. You're not in my basement. I mean, you could be. It's cool. I got a couch. But you're not. I am. And I'm also in the underbelly of the YouTube algorithm, and I'm here making videos about computers, you know, for really unknown reasons. But anyway, I digress. Thank you, Jay. I want to make a video about something that piqued my interest a couple of months ago, and that was the release of this guy, the Ryzen 5 1600AF. Right, so AF means that it's a revision. The original part was AE in the product like serial number, so E and now F. So the AF. And the AF means, in this particular instance, that they took the original Ryzen 5 and they put it on a newer CPU's process node, or manufacturing process node. Right? So it went from being a 14 nanometer process node to being a 12 nanometer process node. And they also put it on the newer architecture of the Ryzen 2000 series instead of the 1000 series. So that means that it's more efficient for power. It has better instructions per clock cycle. It's just an overall a better CPU than the original Ryzen 5 1600. And it retails for $85 typically on Amazon. And I was very curious to see how this new, budget warrior from AMD would stack up against whatever Intel had at a similar price point. So digging around, I found what Intel had at a similar price point, and they had this guy. This is the Intel Core i3 9100F, and it's a 4-core, 4-thread, 14 nanometer process for their 9th series Intel CPUs, and it boosts up to 4. I saw it actually in software boost up to 4.1 gigahertz. This one has a boost clock of 3.7, but it's 6 cores, 12 threads versus 4 cores, 4 threads. But they're within spitting distance on price, so I wanted to put them together. But I didn't just want to take one CPU A and put it on my test bench, run some benchmarks, and then put CPU B on my test bench and run some benchmarks. No. I wanted a battle royale. So I built 2 identical PCs around these 2 processors. I built them in Lian Li Lancool 2s. I put Powercolor RX 5700 graphics cards in there. They're both using Deep Cool Gamax 400 in white CPU coolers, and they're both sitting on MSI Mortar Titanium line motherboards, a B450 for the AMD and a B360 for the Intel, and they both have 16 gigabyte of DDR4 3000 gigahertz RAM. I think this one is from HyperX, so that's Kingston, and this one is XPG, so that's ADATA, but very similar, no real difference. And they both have EVGA power supplies, so that pretty much rounds out the build. So I said, are you ready? Are you ready? Fight! And I put them through a bunch of benchmarks. Productivity benchmarks that focus on CPU capability, and also gaming benchmarks. And if you follow my Discord channel, you know that I have some obligations outside of the channel that I've had to attend to in recent days. So in order to get this video finished and this overall project finished, I've had to kind of, call on some arcane powers. And I've had to find the version of me that exists in an alternate reality called Voice over Mike. So Voice over Mike is going to take it from here. I'm going to turn it over to him, and he's going to finish out. I might come back and give you a conclusion or whatever. He's going to finish out the video. He's going to walk you through the benchmarks and the results from the gameplay and whatnot, while I sit back here and drink my my classic libation. Yeah, that's good. and just try to get it done as expeditiously as possible, right? So some say that he has no corporeal form, and that he exists outside of time and space in a giant void. All I know is that he's called Voice over Mike.
Thank you, Meatbag Mike, for that terrible, terrible introduction and that truly awful Jeremy Clarkson impersonation. I mean, wow. Who lets you on YouTube? Who is adjudicating this? Just terrible. Okay, well, I guess I have a job to do. So first thing we're going to talk about is Cinebench R15. And the results are, as you would expect, given a 6-core 12-thread versus a 4-core 4-thread. The Ryzen 5 1600AF smashes the 9100F by 105% with a 1,243 point score to a 605 point score. Cinebench R20, much the same tale, an 85% margin of victory for the Ryzen 5 1600AF as it just trounces the 9100AF 2838 to 1531. 7-zip is a new one for you, Meatbag Mike. So yeah, much the same margin of victory continues. A 100% margin of victory for the Ryzen 5 1600AF, 46497 to 23,213. And then Geekbench, single core actually. The Intel ekes out a win, a 7.8% win, a 1,036 single core to a 955 for the Ryzen 5. But more cores equals more multi-core points, and the Ryzen 5 just smashes the 9100F 5648 to 3504 for a 61% margin of victory. PC Mark, again, I know you keep telling all your subscribers that you're going to figure out what this means. Well, let me tell you, PC Mark is a benchmark that includes a lot of different or more mundane tasks that most PC users use, like teleconferencing and web browsing and editing photos and using spreadsheets and copying files from here to there. And on this particular benchmark, the Ryzen 5 loses by a very, very narrow margin of 4% to the Intel 9100F. But what is interesting is the 4% margin shrinks to or reverses to a 13% margin of victory for the Ryzen when it comes to digital content creation. And we have seen this before when the Ryzen 5 1600AF went up against Intel's 10-year-old very first 6-core processor, meaning the 980X, the i7 980X. The Ryzen 5 1600AF was very good at digital content creation, but overall, the Intel takes the win very narrowly on PC Mark. Asus Realbench is next, and I know, Meatbag, you really enjoy this one because you feel like it has all of the essentials. It's got image editing and encoding and heavy multitasking. And so the overall system score, the Ryzen 5 1600 smashes the i3-9100F by a 50% margin, 136,000 to 136,839 to 90,722. Truly a just ridiculous margin of victory. Largest of the subcategories was the encoding benchmark, where the Ryzen 5 beats the 9100F by 82%. Moving on to Firestrike, not always the best indicator of how your computer will actually perform in games, but it's quantifiable and repeatable, and we'll pit these two up against each other back to back, and that's what you did, Meatbag Mike. And overall, the total score, the Ryzen 5 ekes out, or not ekes out, but gets a fairly considerable 15% margin of victory with a total system score of 18,664 compared to the i3-9100F's total score of 16,209. Interestingly, the graphics scores, meaning the GPUs, were very much the same, less than a 1.5% difference between the graphics scores. but it's the physics score, where the Ryzen 5 1600AF absolutely throttles the little plucky 4-core, 4-threaded Intel with a 92% margin of victory, 16,513 physics score points to 8,594 for the Intel. On to Unigine Heaven Extreme, an older DX11 benchmark, but still, something that can tax even the newest of systems. So on the total score for the benchmark, the Intel actually ekes out a 1.5% margin of victory, but, and this is where it gets interesting, the minimums and the 1% lows and the 0.1% lows, the AMD actually won handily in every category. A 38% margin of victory on the minimums, a 33% margin of victory on the 1% lows, and a 52% margin of victory on the 0.1% lows. Rainbow Six Siege is next, an oldie but a goodie. It's been around a long time. You can basically run it on a potato, but here it is. And on 1440p low, Rainbow Six Siege returns a overall margin of victory for the Intel i3. The 1% or the low average minimums were 11% in favor of the Intel. The average frame rate was a 1% victory for the AMD processor, but the high frame averages once again went to the Intel. So Intel squeaks out a fairly narrow victory. Even though it gave up the average frame rate win, it still gets the low average and the high average, and is barely beaten out by the overall total average for that benchmark. The Outer Worlds is next, and this one we'll talk about the minimum, the average, the max, and the 1% and 0.1% lows. And overall, it looks as though the Intel system gets the nod, barely. It's 2% ahead, and that equates to just 2 frames a second ahead on the system averages. However, if you look at the minimums and the 1% lows and the 0.1% lows, you will see that the Ryzen 5 1600AF actually, if smooth gaming is your concern, it's the CPU for you. A 5% victory on the minimum frame rate, a 64% victory on the 1% lows, and a 90% victory on the 0.1% lows, meaning that you will experience considerable stutter if you're using a 9100F with a 5700 or 5700 comparable GPU to play the Outer Worlds. Witcher 3 is next, once again in ultra-wide 1440p, all low settings. And here it's there's no equivocating. The Ryzen 5 1600 walks away with the win. 26% victory in the minimum frame rates, a 12% victory in the average frame rate, which is 113 to 100. And the 1% lows is a 97% win, and another 97% win in the 0.1% lows, 58.7 to 29.7 against the Intel i3 processor. Dirt Rally 2 is next, again in 344 by 1440, all ultra low settings. And here again we see the smoothness of the Ryzen 5 reflected in the minimums, the 1% lows and the 0.1% lows, where it gets victories of 15%, 10%, and 16% respectively. But the i3-9100F is not to be discounted, eking out a win in the overall average frame rate of 243 versus 230 with a 5% win for the i3 on the average frame rate. Again, though, if you want smoothness, you're looking at the Ryzen 5. F1 2018 ultra-wide 1440p all low preset is next. And once again, the Ryzen 5 gets the nod, if barely this time. Minimum frame rates, it wins by 4.9%. Average frame rates, another 4%. Maximum frame rates, just 2% in it. And frame time, min to maximum, this is a different a different metric than what we've looked at in any of the other ones. This is basically just comparing the minimum frame time to the maximum frame time and the difference between the two. The difference is smaller for the Ryzen 5 1600AF, and that's what you want. You want the minimum and maximum frame times to be as close together as possible, 2.4 to 2.2. It's a small 8% margin of victory for the Ryzen 5 1600AF. Rise of the Tomb Raider, again in ultra-wide 1440p, low preset, using the DX12 API is next. And we see that the Ryzen 5 1600AF, once again, really does hammer down the minimums, returning a 111% margin of victory in the minimum frame rate, 74 to 35. Now, the i3-9100F actually does capture the crown here for the average frame rates, 120 to 134 overall, and the maximums, 156 to 176. So that's a 10 and 11% victory, respectively. But you got to wonder what your gameplay experience is going to be like looking at the minimum average frame rates and the vast margin between the Ryzen 5 and the i3. Wolfenstein Youngblood is next. Again, this is ultra-wide 1440p, all low, no VSync enabled. And here the 1600AF walks away with it, no questions asked. A 128% difference between it and the 9100F in the minimum frame rates on the two Riverside and the LabX benchmarks, and just a 1 frame per second difference in their average frame rates. And the i3-9100F actually, was able to capture the flag there on the maximum frame rates. But if you're talking about smoothness and playability, the Ryzen 5 is definitely the victor there. Gears 5 is next, and here we see the Ryzen 5 again returning the better minimum, and the i3 eking out the better average. 4% is the margin of victory on the minimums for the Ryzen 5. 5% is the margin of victory on the average frame rate for the i3. And maximums, the i3 also captures the win with a 6.5% margin of victory. Dishonored 2 is next. This is an oldie but a goodie and a visually stunning title in my opinion. And in 1440p, all those settings, the Ryzen 5 captures a 5% victory in the minimum, and the i3 captures a 2% margin of victory in the average frame rates, and they are a statistical tie for maximum frame rates on that particular game. Ghost Recon Wildlands is next, and here we see the Ryzen 5 return just a very slim 3% margin of victory in the minimum frame rates, but a landslide 67% margin of victory and a 258% margin of victory in the 1% and 0.1% lows. They are, for all intents and purposes, tied in average frame rates. 1.9 frames per second divides them, and tied for maximum frame rates. 3.1 frames per second divides them on averages and max. But the Ryzen 5 1600 absolutely hammers the little i3 when it comes to minimums, 1% lows, and 0.1% lows. Fortnight is next. This is 1440p low with a 100% resolution scaling, so a custom preset there. And here we see, once again, the same old story repeats itself. 276% margin of victory on the minimum frame rates for the Ryzen 5, a 54% margin of victory for the 1% lows, and a 132% margin of victory for the 0.1% lows. The averages, the Ryzen 5 does eke out a 6% advantage, and the maximums, the i3 ekes out a similar 6% advantage. But it's really, when you're talking about the smoothness and the stutter, the Ryzen 5 is what you want to look at. Apex Legends is our last, online multiplayer first-person shooter type game, or over-the-shoulder shooter, depending on how you have your video set up. And here Minimum frame rates, the i3 actually gets a win. A 9% win, 7.5 frames divides the two. Average frame rates, the Ryzen gets the win with a little bit better than 2.5% margin of victory. 3.3 frames though, it's basically a statistical tie. Maximums, the Ryzen also gets just a barely ekes out a tie. 1% lows and 0.1% lows though, both go to the Ryzen 5 with a 16.7 margin, 7% margin of victory in the 1% lows. That's a 7 frames per second increase in 1% lows, and a 19.9, basically 20% average better in the 0.1% lows, 24.5 to 20 frames a second in the 0.1% lows. So again, Apex Legends, kind of a mixed bag there. They're all very tight. And with that brings us to the end of the benchmarks, and I'm going to hand it back over to Meatbag Mike and go back to, contemplating my infinite existence outside of time and space. Over to you.
Hey, thanks for that voiceover, Mike. And you know what? You can make fun of my Jeremy Clarkson impersonation all you want to. There's one thing that I know I can do better than you, and that's drink this delicious libation. Try that with your void form lips, which you don't have. You're like the iocane powder of narrators, odorless and most of all, tasteless. Anyway, let's get back to these CPUs here. So what did you guys think? I'll tell you my overall impression is, I characterize it like this. You can go with stutter or you can go with butter, right? Does this return higher average frame rates? In a few games, yeah, it does. Does this return, in a landslide margin of victory, better 1% lows, 0.1% lows, and average minimum low frame rates? Yes. If you want to do anything but game with your computer, you should use this CPU. If you're going to do photo editing, video rendering, 3D modeling, anything that can take advantage of multiple cores, you're going to be light years ahead with this CPU as opposed to this CPU. Multiple cores and threads, because you got 6 cores and 12 threads. Only 4 threads on this guy. It'd be different if this CPU had hyperthreading. If Intel would just, good Lord Intel, give the i3 hyperthreading, 4 cores, 8 threads. It would be a shooting war at that point. I mean, you would definitely be, it would be tight. Yeah, I think if I could buy this for $75 with 4 cores and 8 threads, and buy this for $85 with 6 cores and 12 threads, I think the IPC difference would put the win squarely in the i3's category. Basically, you're making this into an i7-4770K, but with, the 9th gen architecture and enhancements. Intel's not doing that. Maybe they'll do it on the 10th gen. Maybe. I don't know. 10th gen's going to require a new motherboard. Whereas you can buy this and put this on a B350 and be good to go, right? You can get a used B350 board for like $50. Buy this for $85 and you're in business for $125. Whereas this is $75 and you're going to need at least a B360 board, which is not comparable to an AMD B350. So B360 is fairly new and recent, or B365 for the Intel motherboards, fairly new and recent, and fairly expensive and hard to find used. I know, I looked. So the Intel motherboard in this PC costs about $25 more than the AMD motherboard in this computer did. So yeah, stutter and butter, right? The gameplay, like quality of life, is just not there with this CPU if you're playing for high refresh rate first person shooter type games. I think this would actually make a fairly decent CPU for a game that for games that are really more GPU intensive. If you take the load off of this little fella and put it on your GPU with higher graphical settings and higher quality or higher resolutions, then this would become less of a bottleneck because you're going to put a lot of the load on the GPU, and this guy can shovel frames at it fast enough to avoid some of that stutter. I did that. If you look at the benchmark screen captures on the video itself, if you look in the top left, that is this little fellow running at 1080p maxed out settings. So you can see what the frame rates are. If you want to, you know, zoom in and look at the MSI Afterburner screen monitoring on all of the screen capture settings, it's the i3-9100F running in this PC with the 5700 from Powercolor at 1080p. Whatever the game is, it's at max settings, maxed out settings, absolutely. And all of the screen grabs for the productivity benchmarks are also the 9100F running. So what do you think? What would you buy given this, right? If you're looking for, you know, a cheap PC and you want to be able to game at high resolutions and high graphical quality, and you're not looking for 144 frames a second, this might be a huckleberry, you know. But you're only saving $10. This was $74.99. This is $85, right? You're saving $10. You're not going to get a significant upgrade in your GPU for that, or RAM, or motherboard, and you're going to spend that $10 on the motherboard, by the way, if you buy this. Typically, you might be able to scrounge around and find a cheaper motherboard, but I mean, it doesn't leave you much of an upgrade path, right? If you put this on an X470 motherboard, or a Tomahawk B450 Max or something like that, that would leave you a considerably longer upgrade path than if you put this on a B360. I mean, I guess you can put a 9700K on a B360, but you get no overclocking, right? This overclocked and unlocked. I didn't do any overclocking, by the way. I want to make that perfectly clear. I guess I should have said that at the beginning. These were put into the motherboard's default BIOS settings and run. I didn't do XMP. I think actually both of these wound up running at 2400 megahertz on the RAM instead of the stated 3000 megahertz because I didn't enable XMP on either one of these, right? They were at bog standard settings. No overclock applied, no fan profiles manipulated with the MSI Afterburner. I simply use MSI Afterburner as a benchmarking tool, as a logging tool for the data. Now, I may go in and see, you know, if I can get some more horses out of the AMD since it's unlocked. This is not unlocked. That's another factor to consider. I think, all in all, if you want my best judgment, you're better off in the long run buying this as a starter PC CPU than you are buying this. There is an upgrade path for this. It's more expensive, considerably more expensive than the upgrade path for this, if you do it right. You got to do a little bit of planning when it comes to motherboards and whatnot. But yeah, I think your quality of life right out the gate is going to be better with the Ryzen 5 1600 than it is going to be with the Intel 9100F. And I think that your upgrade path is significantly longer, especially if Ryzen 4000 series chips continue to be on the AM4 socket. And you know, if you put this on a cheap, or not cheap, but a decent X470 motherboard, you would be able to run the life of that PC out until you hit whatever Ryzen 4000 series CPU your VRM can no longer support, right? That's several years. That's probably 8 to 10 years worth of CPU upgrades, as long as the motherboard holds out, right? I don't think you get that with this platform. Intel is going to move away from the LGA 1151 socket with the 10th generation, and it's be a LGA 1200. So, you know, even if you got a Z390 motherboard, and put this on there, your upgrade path ends at the 9900KS should you be foolish enough to buy that monstrosity of a CPU. And oh, by the way, you're going to need a much, much, much better cooler to run a 9900KS than you are to run 3800X or even a 3950X, because they consume a ton of power. So right now it looks like budget winner is AMD. Much smoother gaming experience. I got to give it to the plucky little 4-core though. It is capable. I mean, if this is all that's available to you, if you live in an area where you can't buy a Ryzen 5 1600 for $85, but you can buy this for around $75 to $85, then it'll get it done. And I appreciate the Intel i3 series and all the years that they've been around for that. They will get it done. You know, it may not always be pretty. That's what I said in my 10-year anniversary of the Core i3 video a few months ago. But today, right now, my money is on AMD for sure. And on that bombshell, that's my last Jeremy Clarkson reference for the video. I promise. I'm out. Actually, I'm not out. Ha! Tricked you. Hey, please like and subscribe for more content. If you'd like to interact with me directly, you can go to my Facebook page. I'm at Solid State Alchemy. You can follow me on Twitter or tweet at me at State Solid. You can please go to my Discord channel. I will put an invite link in the description for the Discord channel. I'll put Amazon links for both of these bad boys, and I'll link to Lian Li Global for the Lancool 2. I love these ATX Tower PC cases. They're phenomenal. Unfortunately, they're getting hard to find. I did hear that they are going to redesign them and release them as like a mesh front, but I actually do prefer the metal front. But you know, potato potato. All right, now I am out.